If you're sick of struggling to draw a scene freehand where everything is in the correct proportion, both within each subject but also across all the parts of the scene, then this method of freehand drawing that I use when I draw directly in ink may just be the breakthrough that you need to get some different results. Now, this is the National Gallery in Berlin in Germany, and it took me just over an hour to draw in real time. Now, the way this system works is to find something that's going to be easy to draw, keeping the right proportions. And by proportions, we mean the relationship between height and width, or getting the angles the same so that the shape looks the same, perhaps larger or smaller. The scale can change, but the relative positioning and the sizes of the various elements don't change. So in this scene, I've chosen the two columns and the space behind them on the right-hand side of this colonnade because I thought that rectangular space is the easiest one to get. Now, looking at this, I think possibly I'm just a little bit wide there, but the space I've created next to this with that third column is probably more what we want. But we also need to be aware when we have a scene such as this where what's behind the columns creates quite a distinct effect, and it can create an illusion of a shape that's not really there because it would be easy here to be seeing the darker rectangle between the columns above the frieze that's behind on that back wall than the actual size of the columns of the space going down to ground level. And the thickness of our pen line can also affect the way something looks. And we need to be aware of that, particularly when we're drawing a lot of detail quite some distance away. Now you see me using my method just to work out the angle. If I'm drawing on location, I can hold my pen up at the angle of whatever I'm drawing, align it, and then bring it straight down onto my paper. It's a lot more accurate than it sounds. And it's particularly important with these extreme angles because they're the ones that it's actually quite hard to draw. And I often don't believe it until I've drawn it and then it looks right. So it is important to make sure we get those right because they create a lot of the visual drama, but they also lock into place the building looking right from a perspective point of view. Now, when we're drawing like this, drawing the space between the objects is just as important. Drawing by negative space is very important because we use that to check whether our objects are in the right place by the space we create between them. And I'm trying to draw this same size because that's the most straightforward thing to do in a demo. But if I wanted to, say, draw this half as large again, then that very first shape I would draw half as large again. I draw the columns half as high and half as wide again, and the space between half as wide again. And then that sets me up for keeping the whole scene in proportion. You're watching this being drawn at 3 times real-time speed, at least the architecture parts. When I draw the foliage and those hedges down the front and the hatching for the darker shadows, I've actually sped it up to 6 times because there is a lot of repetition there, and I think you can start to see what I'm doing. Doing these sculptures, trying to not draw a figure, but to capture the effect, just the way light and dark and the silhouette, trying to capture that and not worrying about drawing little arms and legs and drapery and whatnot. So now we come to the tree. As you can see, I haven't gone into the detail with the gallery itself. I haven't tried to do all the stuff behind the columns because I find it is better to block in the whole scene in some way, or at least stretch into some of the far corners of our scene. But everything that I draw, when I look in the reference, I look to see how it lines up with what I've already drawn in the reference. And then on my drawing, I can line it up with that same section that I've already drawn to create confidence in positioning what I'm currently drawing, if that makes sense. So the more we draw, the faster this method becomes. It's very slow at the start because we have to take a lot of care to create, if you like, our measuring section so that it's accurate. If we don't do that, it's like using a ruler where every inch is a different width. So we need to make sure that first section is really accurate, but then we can start to move out. And if we put that same care into the relative proportions, the relative lengths of heights and widths and so forth, getting the angles correct, we can be aligning it with what we've drawn, and this helps us to keep the scale correct across the whole drawing. Now, I've switched from the 0.3 I've been using to a 0.5 millimeter pen, and that's both because this is closer, so I want the actual line work to feel stronger because that's the effect we get in life with closer objects. And also it lets me create the very dark, almost silhouette foliage effect much more quickly with a thicker pen. Now you'll notice for the tree, I've actually used vertical lines to reflect the colour and the shadows on the tree. Now I could have gone horizontally, but I felt that vertical was a better contrast with the lines around it. That it created a just visually a more pleasing effect. I often though use short horizontal lines for trees because we can use those to reflect the cylindrical feel of the tree. But I figured that at some stage I'm going to add more lines to create value that will create the cylindrical feel. Now, with the foliage, this isn't a video on drawing trees, but look, we need to take as much care with positioning all the elements of the tree as much as the architecture. So exactly how far the branches come, approximately the shape. You'll notice that I stopped drawing the architecture before the tree branches are going to connect with it. Always draw the closest things first. And so here I am now with this round hedge. Notice that I'm not trying to draw the leaves. I'm trying to draw the effect of the shadows. And pay attention to how I do the silhouette edges of this. I don't draw a straight line because that wouldn't create the effect that we see. The effect is of a jagged line. And so I want to capture that, which of course is created by all the leaves. There are a few figures to place. Now it's incredibly important when we place figures, even when they're as far away as this, that we really slow down. Because figures create scale. Intuitively we know how large a person is, and therefore we use them to reflect on what we see around them, especially in the distance. And so we particularly want to make sure we don't draw our figures too large, because that will in effect make the gallery smaller. Now, when it comes to these hatching lines for the shadows, I choose whichever direction is going to look best. And that means both the direction that's going to capture the underlying form, which in this case is the flat ground, but also that will visually be of some contrast to the lines I've already drawn, so that we see separation of various structures that may be similarly dark, as is the case with the right-hand sides of these rounds of hedges and the ground. So here I am with the figures. I find the best way to make sure we don't draw the figures too large when they're in the distance is to try and underdraw the size of the head. Because if we draw the head too large, then we either have to make the whole body too large, or we have to have a large head on a small body. So my rule of thumb is always draw the head a little bit smaller than I think it's going to be, and then it's nearly always correct. And if not, I can just add some hair that widens it a bit or raises it a bit, stick a cap on or something. And if you're finding this helpful, then why not hit the like button for me right now and help me out as well. Thanks. So we've actually got through a surprising amount of this now. It's a case of going bit by bit. And with these hedges, these round hedges, I could align how far across they came firstly from my reference photo with what was happening in the architecture of the building sitting behind. And that's the way I could confidently make sure I didn't make the hedges too wide coming into our right-hand side, because I could align each of these 3 rounds of hedging with the columns above, or in fact extending past the end column. So now I've got these part of this, another figure we have here, the same, trying to capture the effect. I'm not trying to draw a little man or woman. I can't remember what this one was. The important thing is, though, is to get the angles correct. And also to have it look symmetrical, but symmetrically affected by perspective. So the 2 triangles we have, if you like, on each side are not the same. And I need to have observed that in my reference before I could create it in my drawing. By looking at the shape, that what we see of that section of walling, we can actually seek to draw that shape instead of perhaps focusing on this is a stairway and trying to draw that. In fact, it's usually helpful to disconnect these shapes from the subject and to really just see them as a bit of geometry that we have to copy. There's some absolutely beautiful carvings in the, it's not really a balustrade, just in this upper part, which serves as a railing. I actually have a separate video on just drawing this detail. And so now we're doing these much further away parts. Now, the way I find best to create the effect of distance, the sense of something is a long way away, is to copy the effect of what happens in life. And in life, when things are far away, besides being smaller, we see them less distinctly. And so I use lighter lines. We also see them less clearly, and we see less detail. So I draw less detail. And you can see the effect that's having here, that this hint of architecture that I'm drawing does feel much further back than the tree. And when I finish the line work for the actual gallery, it will come a little bit forward, and those extreme left and right hand side sections will sit even further back. So now, again, I'm wanting to suggest the detail that's behind the colonnade because it's quite important, I think, to the overall effect. It stops the front of the building just looking blank, which is always nice. But we don't want to do it in a way that draws the eye too much, because it really is still the columns that we should be focusing on. So here I am doing the painted frieze, I think it is, that's on that back wall. Oh, it's actually the front wall of the gallery, I suppose, the back wall of the colonnade. With this sort of detail, it's good to go a bit lightly at the start, and then we can adjust the values by the end. I'm reflecting the fact that there is a shadow of each of these columns being cast on the wall behind. At some point, I'm going to have to finish the rest of this foliage. I did as much as I could bear at the time, and then I thought, look, I'll do the rest later. So now we have this edge in, this gutter in, and I made sure I measured that as much, as carefully as I measured every other angled line, and considered it just as carefully. This is the sort of line, it's very easy just to think, oh, it's just a straight line. But it actually has an angle, and it is a very important angle because the straight ahead point is actually between this line and the line coming down from the top of the gallery. So it's a great visual trick just to focus our attention. And now doing enough lines that I create the shadow. With trees and foliage, shade and shadow, it's often good for the shadow to not do it evenly, all the same value, but to create variation, because that's what we get in life. The canopies are thicker in some parts than others and cast deeper shade. So I've just added some more value to the trunk, but again with vertical lines, so that even though the value is very similar to the foliage, we can still distinguish between the different elements of the tree. And I'm now doing my best with what I've already drawn to recreate what we see in the reference as closely as possible. I don't want to have a generic tree that, oh, it's a tree, and I just stop looking at my reference and I use the pattern that I use for leaves, and I just basically make up the tree's branches because it doesn't really matter where they go. I find when we do that, we end up with a lot of very generic trees that all look the same. I want this tree to look like this tree, capturing the effect of the leaves and the way they hang, particularly at this distance and from this perspective. So therefore, I need to pay as much attention to trees and foliage or to hedges as I do to the columns, as I do to the sculptures, as I do to the statues. Every single part needs as much attention as observation, although I may treat it differently with my line work, with what pen I use even. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. Please hit the like button if you haven't already. But if you don't draw this way, if you're more inclined to draw much larger shapes, maybe define the overall size of the building before you start to add the detail, and if you find that's not always working for you so well and ends up with things that aren't the right proportion and where the detail doesn't fit, this might be the way that makes things fall into place for you more. I find it extremely accurate, even when we move across the whole scene with a lot of different elements to draw. The principles seem to work just as well regardless. And if you'd like to have a go drawing this, I'll put the reference photo on my channel community page. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.